Um, okay, Hacking HR Silicon Valley chapter has a core network of individuals who are from diverse background. Uh, like Anna, I already mentioned. Ashley, who is co-founder and managing partner of Unified Stories. Suchi, that's me, your learning manager for the session. I'm one of the talent management, change management, HR professional, and I have worked extensively into culture building and OD consulting as well. Manish Kasliwal, he comes from a very technical background, but he has been bringing insights with respect to business transformation and operations leading from Cisco. Rob Riddle, who is a part of, again, technical background, he is the head of program management and business operation at Waco. So, Anna, would you like to throw some light on how Hacking HR Silicon Valley chapter incepted and the purpose behind it?
Certainly. I just will throw a thank you to everyone that makes the time today. I wanted just to say that we joined forces from different parts of functional or operational aspects in order to change how HR is being implemented in the workplace, much needed in that very much changing era. And I would say that it's from your part as well, every one of you, you can change how things are being done. So you can join us either in this chapter or in any other chapter. There are 200 around the globe in order to change how things are being done in HR. Just like us, you can be a partner in that and you can volunteer to make that happen. Back to you, Susie. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And thank you to our distinguished guests as well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Anna, for bringing all of us and actually on the same page about Hacking HR Silicon Valley chapter. Now, let me introduce Ashley again for the individuals who are joining right now. So, Ashley and her Ashley would be host speaker for this session. And Ashley has earned her undergrad in international business and marketing, her MBA in project management. She has extensive experience in diversity and inclusion, serving on ethnic diversity steering committees, leading women's roundtable diversity dialogues, and producing inclusion-focused video series. As the co-founder and managing partner of United Stories, Ashley works with educational institutions and enterprise clients to infuse life into inclusion initiatives through the power of personal storytelling. Apart from Ashley, I would also like to welcome our distinguished guest and for the fireside chat, who is Crystal Johnson. Crystal is the founder of Meaningful, and she has extensive experience working in the field of employee experience, inclusion, diversity, and bringing limelight onto hiring, retention, as well as engagement of women bodies, as well as co-working communities within the workspace. Over to you, Ashley.
All right, thank you, Suchi. All right, and I want to remind everyone that today we're looking for an engaging conversation, so please make sure to make good use of that chat feature in Zoom, and we'll try to address as many of the questions as we possibly can in this fire chat discussion. So I'm going to start off the conversation with talking about why we're here. What are we talking about today? We want to go beyond just an unconscious bias 101 conversation. So we're going to establish the definitions of bias and unconscious bias, but we're really wanting to dive into a lot of the strategies and tactics and actions that we can take to reduce unconscious biases and its impact within the workplace. So starting off in the definitions, we can go to the next slide, please. All right, so bias as a definition is a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way that's considered to be unfair. So unconscious biases then are the social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside their own conscious awareness. And everyone holds unconscious bias beliefs about various social and identity groups stemming from our natural tendency to organize social worlds by categorizing. So that's to lay the foundation. We want to make sure that we're, again, diving in deep into the conversation and making sure that we're discussing the solutions and how to identify unconscious biases within the workplace. So if we can go to the next slide, I'd love to introduce the guest speaker with us here today, Crystal Johnson, founder of Meaningful. And I've had the great pleasure of knowing Crystal now for a couple of years, and I've really appreciated her approach to tackling diversity and inclusion, not only in the workplace, but also socially as well. So Crystal Johnson is an inclusion and belonging strategist with a wealth of inclusion and diversity expertise from various industries, including gaming and media entertainment. And in her current role as a senior consultant for inclusion, diversity, and corporate social responsibility in gaming, she partners with key business leaders to create innovative people, culture, and community strategies that help to foster an environment of belonging. Now, in addition to her diversity, equity, and inclusion work by day, Crystal is the founder of Meaningful and co-host of the We Are Meaningful podcast. I absolutely love this podcast that Crystal has. Meaningful exists to ensure that Black and Brown women have the tools, resources, and networks needed to thrive in corporate spaces. The We Are Meaningful podcasts highlight their anonymous experiences and solutions to support navigating them. So, Crystal, I want to start off this discussion by remembering back to the time where we first got to meet in person. And in that time, you helped me look at unconscious bias differently. You really introduced a way of reframing the entire concept of unconscious bias itself. So I'd love for you to open up and tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, so first I want to say thank you so much for the invite, and thanks everyone for your time today and sharing your platform. So when Ashley and I met a couple of years ago, we talked about unconscious bias and this concept of being consciously inclusive. So when I think about unconscious bias, it's just that, it's unconscious. And we make billions of decisions each day, and those decisions are steeped in our values, our beliefs, and stereotypes that we've heard over time. So as Ashley mentioned, our brain takes these shortcuts and it groups the images we see and the things that we hear to efficiently make it make sense. And it's helpful when we're in danger. However, when you're in the workplace, 9 times out of 10, you really aren't in danger. So it's really important to identify and be honest about the ways that bias might creep in for each one of us, giving us that opportunity to pause and be more intentional in how we respond and react. So for example, if you are unconsciously awarding the men on your team for being assertive, however, you're punishing the women and people of color on your team for the exact same behavior, it's an opportunity to pause and be intentionally inclusive, to reassess and proceed in a way that allows you to be fair and equitable in how you assess everyone on your team. When I think about being consciously inclusive versus unconscious bias in general, I think that when people think about unconscious bias, it's always from a negative place. And I think that if we reframe it in a way where we're talking about being consciously inclusive, we're talking about not making decisions just on a whim or just really quickly, but really being more intentional about how we proceed in situations that we may have in the past just proceeded very quickly on.
That's great. That's great. And I love that focus on taking action and really pausing and thinking, like you mentioned. I appreciate that approach so much because it puts the power back in our hands. Whereas the framework of unconscious bias, it's like it's happening to us and we can't control it.
Yeah.
Reframing it, rethinking about it in terms of conscious inclusion, now we can take action. Now we can say, I'm thinking about it and I can do something about it. So I really appreciate that approach. That was life-changing for me, by the way. So when we start to talk about addressing unconscious bias in the workplace, we've seen, some companies, some individuals, they're really starting at square one. They are maybe brand new to the concept of unconscious bias and are just starting out on that journey. So I'd love to talk through where do people start? What are some of the foundational steps that they should take to start addressing unconscious bias in general?
Great question. So first, I want to say that unconscious bias training is a trigger for me. And it's because I think a lot of companies have taken the route where they do training and they think, oh, we're done. That's all we need to do is just hire someone to come in and talk about unconscious bias or do some research online. We talk about it and then we're done. So that is definitely a trigger for me. But when we think about where to start, I have 3 ways that we can start. So first, I think it's important for organizations to recognize that no one is immune from unconscious bias. And that means that our processes and data have unconscious bias wrapped into them. I actually met with a CHRO in the past, and he just said, I'm not biased. I have no bias at all. And hearing that from someone who's at the highest levels of the organization and reporting to the CEO is not a good look. So it's really important that if you are in a leadership position, that you are modeling and helping people to understand that we all have unconscious bias. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It just means that we all have biases. Mm-hmm. So second, I would say that you want to obtain quantitative and qualitative data about the experience of underrepresented talent in your workplace. So that includes women, people of color, the LGBTQ community, those with disabilities, etc. So your quantitative data can be obtained from things like your employee engagement survey and any reports from your employee relations team, where people may have reported an exclusive environment. And then your qualitative data could be obtained through any focus groups that you might want to hold and any anecdotal stories that your leaders, HR, or even your employee resource group leaders may have heard from employees or members. And then the last thing is to have a plan. So in the beginning of my response to this question, I talked about how training is a trigger for me. So organizations have, and they continue to make this mistake of unconscious bias training for the solution rather than it being part of the solution. So we have to realize that training will never solve or mitigate bias. It takes a holistic approach and action to address the gaps and opportunities that you found. And that would include adjusting your policies and processes, a shift in behaviors of the people in your organization, and also checking in on the adoption of those behaviors, as well as accountability to measure, just to name a few. And if you forget everything else that I say during this call, please remember that there is no easy button for this work, and we have to take a holistic approach.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Absolutely. Absolutely. And it is sad. There are too many organizations that think, oh, we'll just do that training like you mentioned. And there, we've solved it. Everybody's been trained up. And we don't expect that in any other space in business. We don't expect that in leadership development. You don't give leadership development and call it good. We don't expect that in training our engineers for new and advanced positions in the organization. It's a constant process. I appreciate that you brought that up. I would also add to the accountability piece. I think that's so key. It's not enough to just say, oh, we want to reduce unconscious biases and put that as a strategic imperative for the organization, but we really need to hold people accountable, to your point. Yes. What do your numbers look like? What actions are you taking in the organization? Really putting that responsibility to take action and show up and make changes in the company.
Yeah, and hopefully your organization is transparent enough to share that information if you're in a position to actually create some sort of change in the organization, because there are still, unfortunately, a lot of organizations who do not share data even internally. I was at a conference earlier this week, and it was mentioned that I think they did a survey, and maybe almost 40% of chief diversity officers still don't have access to data. How can you do your job if you don't have access to data?
Oh my gosh, it's sad. It's sad, but I'm glad we're having conversations like this to hopefully help overcome some of those challenges. On that transparency piece, that reminded me of the Deloitte survey, the Deloitte Millennials survey that came out in 2019. And one of the findings of that survey was that millennials and Gen Zers are increasingly more wary of what business is doing. They suspect business of having like impure motives a lot of the time. So that transparency piece can go a long way towards helping an organization attract more millennials, retain more millennials. And maybe you've had similar experiences, Crystal, but in my line of work, from what I've seen, when an organization is honest and says, yep, we recognize these are problem areas for us, here's what we want to do to fix it, they get a lot of respect for that. What's your experience been like in that area?
100% agree. When organizations are transparent, people are more likely to not treat you as harshly because you're saying, listen, I'm going to be transparent that we are not where we want to be. However, this is where we're going. And people actually do take on responsibility, as they should, as individuals in the organization, to play their part when it comes to creating a more inclusive environment, or with the attraction, recruitment, growth, and retention of women and other underrepresented groups.
Absolutely. And if they feel like there's an alignment of values between what the organization is doing and what the individual believes in, they're more likely to stay and help that organization find success. Absolutely.
For sure.
You mentioned a piece here that brought another thought to mind, the taking that individual responsibility and people wanting to do their part. On that same vein, I would say one good way to start in the unconscious bias and the conscious inclusion process is to start with you. Start with you as an individual, you yourself. Like you mentioned, everyone has ingrained biases. Nobody's immune to that. So I really love the trend that mindfulness has been the momentum that mindfulness has been gaining recently, taking that moment to pause and think, like you mentioned before. And I know personally, one of the ways that I've been tackling my own unconscious biases is to routinely ask myself, why? Why do I think X, Y, Z? What led to that immediate thought process? Trying to get out of the reactionary brain and into the processing, thinking things through brain. So that's something that I've found helpful for myself.
Absolutely. And I think one other thing to call out is that you are not just unconsciously biased to people who are different than you. You can also be unconsciously biased to people who are seemingly the same as you. So I was at this conference. It was so amazing. Vernee Myers was there. She's the VP of Inclusion at Netflix. And she was telling a story about her being at the grocery store the week before. And she saw a woman who was of smaller stature, and this woman had on scrubs. And in her mind, she said, I love nurses. And then she had to catch herself. Now, this woman has been doing inclusion and diversity work for 20 plus years. And she had to catch herself and say, why do I think she's a nurse? She could be a doctor. I don't know. So then she walks up to the woman, because she's very friendly, and she says, hello, what has you out so late? And she said, I work for X, Y, and Z hospital. So in her mind, she's like, that's not helping. So then I think she asked her, what kind of work do you do there? And she said she was an obstetrician. Now, this woman was a Black woman, and so is Vernee. But she made this unconscious, she made up this unconscious story in her mind about this woman being a nurse. Now, had she walked up to her to say, I love nurses, this woman would have been totally offended because she was actually a doctor. There's nothing wrong with nurses except for when you're actually a doctor. So.
Oh, I love that example. It's just hitting home that it's even somebody with 22 plus years of experience can have those immediate reactionary thoughts, and we need to have that constant check on ourselves.
Totally.
Excellent. I am seeing some questions come in from the chat here, so I want to incorporate those into the conversation. We have a question around, once you have access to data, let's assume that you're not in that 40% of people who don't have access to their own diversity and inclusion data, which touch points would you suggest where changes can be made? And they have provided some examples in this question.
Yeah.
During hiring, they're asking, what can we do differently? During progression reviews, what can we do differently? During pay decisions, what can we do? So some very specific tactical pieces. Crystal, I know that based on your experience, you've had a lot of experience with diversity and inclusion in recruiting. So maybe we want to tackle that subject first.
Yeah, so to answer the question, I would actually say that you want to address the entire employee life cycle. And if you have the opportunity to address your products and services at the same time, you also should. Because it's not just about recruiting, but it's also about, as you mentioned, growth and progression within the organization, and also retention of talent as well. So my advice would be, once you have an opportunity to take a look at the qualitative and quantitative data, you want to make sure that you're prioritizing different tactics and actions under each part of the employee life cycle based upon where you see the most gaps. So for example, if your organization is bleeding women and African American Black talent at a double the rate of what you see for white men, for example, then you know that that's a group of people that you need to focus on, because those people are leaving the organization at a much higher rate than others. If you notice that you don't have any women in leadership, and the last time someone was promoted in leadership was more than a year ago from a certain group, or 3+ years ago, then you know that that is a group that you need to focus on. If you're looking at your employee engagement survey and you see that for Hispanic Latinx talent, they're saying, I don't feel like I belong and I don't feel like diversity and inclusion is a priority here, then that's something that you want to focus on. Again, just figuring out under which bucket of the life cycle those things are falling under.
That's great.
I hope that's helpful.
Yes, that was very helpful. And for anyone else who has questions, please feel free to submit them in the chat as well. We'll do everything in our power to address them we've got a little bit less than 10 minutes or so for this conversation, so we want to address as many of your questions as possible. We have a follow-up here. It says, great point that this is not just about recruiting, but the whole employee life cycle. I love that you emphasize that, Crystal, because it's not just about bringing in as many diverse people as possible and just bringing them in the door. It's about the entire experience. You mentioned retention, development, advancement, absolutely. So we have now on the screen, you can see different types of unconscious biases. Drawing back to what Crystal talked about in terms of seeing some people, even people who are like you, in a biased way, because that's your framework. That kind of falls under the like the confirmation bias or the affinity bias, this halo effect. So we have a variety of different types here listed on this screen for the group to peruse while we continue to chat. So I want to continue to dive in. We've been talking about strategies a lot already and specific points that we had based on the question. We mentioned transparency being a key thing in terms of unconscious bias. I'd love to kind of shift now and talk about some of the roadblocks to addressing unconscious bias. Like you mentioned, Crystal, it's not just a wave the magic wand of we've got an unconscious bias training and now everything is fixed. What are some of those other hurdles and roadblocks to addressing unconscious bias in the workplace?
Yeah, so some of the roadblocks that I've seen are more so with middle management, and I call that the messy middle. And I would say most of the time, your C-suite executives and individual contributors, they will be on board with the understanding of and the actions that they need to take to mitigate bias. And the breakdown usually occurs, as I mentioned before, at the mid-level management area, because they're kind of squished and sandwiched in the middle between the C-suite and the individual contributors. And for them, this work can often seem squishy. So it's not prioritized because they have you as an individual contributor saying, I need. And then they have the executive saying, I need. So they're trying to prioritize those things rather than focusing on something that they believe is squishy. So 3 roadblocks that I would call out are integration. So a lot of times inclusion and diversity work is added on the back end of something else. So it's really important that you don't decouple the work that you're doing from everyday work in the business, because again, it won't get done. So you have to clearly define the connections between creating an inclusive environment and unconscious bias, mitigating unconscious bias with the work that they're doing every day. It is invaluable. The second thing I would say is being intentional and modeling. So ensure that you aren't only sharing what the problems are in the workplace, but you're also sharing how these leaders can create a more inclusive environment. And you want to make sure that they are in relation to the things that they're doing every day. So whether that means, how do I lead more inclusive meetings? So that could mean, how am I making sure that everyone has the opportunity to share their thoughts and experiences? How am I making sure that in a meeting, people aren't speaking over each other? How am I making sure that the women and the people of color in the room aren't asked to do the administrative tasks like taking notes or ordering coffee, etc.? And then the third thing I would say is a roadblock is the lack of systemic change. So we can't always, we want to, but we can't always rely on leaders, because we're human, to be more intentional because they went through a training or have been told what to do. So it's also important for us to look at our policies, processes, and products to ensure that as an organization, we're also walking the walk by taking an inward look on the things that we're rolling out and shifting our approaches. When we do look at our policies, processes, and products and help them to become more inclusive, we will see an increase in the attraction, growth, and retention of underrepresented employees, as well as our customer base.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Those were fantastic. I appreciate the robust addressment of that. Kind of as you were talking a little bit, you mentioned that we can't just hold leaders to this work. And we know, like, everyone's human. Everyone's going to make mistakes. And especially that middle management group that you mentioned, getting constantly squeezed. Some of the additional pieces that I've seen in talking with individuals who are specifically trying to work on managing and mitigating their unconscious bias is this fear. In general, people are afraid of asking the questions to address some of the unconscious biases that are going on in their minds. Some people are afraid to say the wrong thing or say something insensitive, even if they have positive intent towards learning. And I know that that's a tricky balance, because we also want to manage the weight and the emotional labor that people from marginalized communities have to be constantly teaching those of the majority groups how to be inclusive and to reduce their own unconscious biases. So I've seen fear also play a part in this. And generally speaking, what I've heard from individuals is, don't be afraid to ask the question. Like, state your positive intent up front. You know, I'm working on my allyship, or I'm working to better understand this idea of diversity and inclusion and how to be inclusive. Can I ask you this question? So I would encourage any of our audience attendees, if you've ever wondered and ever felt like, oh, what do I do? What do I say? Do your own research. And, you know, if you need to ask the question, come at it from a place of positive intent and asking your question. And I always tell people, if the answer is no, they don't want to talk about it, be very respectful and move forward. But there's a lot of research and resources out there. You can do your own self-education as well. I see our time counter.
Okay.
I see our time counter. We've got about a minute and a half, so I want to make sure we can wrap this up effectively. I definitely want to thank you, Crystal, so much for all of your wisdom and your insights. It's so invaluable to this conversation. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And I want to thank all of our attendees as well. Really appreciate the engagement via the chat there, and I would like to encourage everyone to continue to follow Hacking HR. There's a LinkedIn group. It's got over 75,000 members right now, so you can be a part of the movement towards creating the future of work and innovating in HR. I'm going to transition over to Suchi now.
Thank you so much, Ashley and Crystal, for sharing quite practical insights from the industry and what's happening in the work and how we all can partner in overcoming unconscious biasness by raising our self-awareness. Thank you so much. Thank you, audience, for joining and asking multiple interesting questions. So we are doing the wrap up. Thank you.